Success. So as Teo mentioned, my research really looks at sort of the role of legal system involvement and its impact on health and vulnerable communities. I'm especially interested in HIV and substance use. So today I'll talk a little bit about something that I guess I've been working on for longer than a decade now, which really ages me, but the considerations for those of you who are interested in developing risk reduction interventions for formerly incarcerated individuals. I'll talk a little bit about my experiences. Hopefully, it will help those of you out who are interested in working in this area and with this specific population. For those of you who aren't as familiar with the legal system as I am, here's a little background. There are about 7 million people who are currently engaged in the legal system. In the US, we had the highest incarceration rate in the world. We earned a gold medal in that, honestly. But there are 2.3 million people currently incarcerated. That means that they are in institutionalized settings. And there are many problems with that, but as far as health is concerned, they are largely not included in a lot of the health surveys that are collected. So we know very little bit about their health while they're incarcerated. And a large proportion of this population are incarcerated and for longer periods of time, even for committing drug-related offenses. So why is it important for those of us interested in HIV research? Well, it's because incarcerated individuals are about 3 times more likely to be infected with HIV or living with HIV, I should say. And contact with the legal system is a pretty common occurrence for people living with HIV and for people who use drugs. So I'm really interested in that intersection. At one point, I would say about 24% of the people who were living with HIV had passed through a correctional institution in the US at least one point in their lives. And so for people who initiate, for people who are living with HIV who initiate their regimen while they're incarcerated, they do very well. They achieve optimal adherence. For people who are living with HIV and who are incarcerated, a lot of them find out about their status when they become incarcerated. And for the longest time, I even did my dissertation on HIV in correctional settings because the literature was suggesting that people were getting HIV while they were incarcerated, and that's not happening. What is happening is they're getting it in the community, but they're learning of their status once they're incarcerated. So for people who know their status while they're incarcerated, the regimen, they do very well. And part of it is because you're not managing it independently. What's happening is someone is telling you exactly when to take your medication, exactly how much to take. And so like you have a lot of support in that area. And I hate to say that because I would not prescribe, prison or jail settings for anyone. But one of the problems is once they return back to their community, once they transition from custody back to the community, and 95% of the people who experience incarceration return to their community, and 600,000 people are released from these institutions annually. So once they get back into their community, that's where they need more support for medication adherence. And a lot of the public health benefits that were gained, like during incarceration, are lost during this period. And a lot of people are learning how to manage this chronic condition that they were just diagnosed with independently. And a lot of them have limited access to resources. And so back when I finished the postdoc, which was back in 2013 is when I got this K, I wanted to learn more about what is happening when people are returning to the community from incarcerated settings, especially for people who are either at high risk for HIV or for people who have HIV. I was really interested in adapting or informing interventions, to help reduce this risk. So I had 3 phases for my KL1 project. First of all, I wanted to administer a quantitative survey. As I said, there was not a lot known about this population, about what happens to them once they return to their communities, like what are the needs and barriers to more protective behaviors. And for the second phase, I wanted to conduct in-depth interviews, like to provide more context around what is happening when they're returning to the community and to what extent are they at risk for either transmitting HIV if they already had it or acquiring HIV if they don't. And finally, I wanted to use that information to develop and pilot test an HIV risk reduction intervention for formerly incarcerated individuals. In the beginning, I was really interested in people who didn't have HIV yet, but hopefully in the next couple of slides, you'll be able to see why my mind changed. One thing that I found through the quantitative survey was that people felt as they returned to the community that they were starting from scratch. And I understand that. For people who are in jail, you're incarcerated for less than a year. So for some people, maybe it's 24 hours, maybe it's a few days. That's not as disruptive as it is for the people who are incarcerated in prisons where you're there for at least a year. So you lose practically everything. If you have custody, you lose custody of your children. You lose your housing, you lose employment, all of those things. So when people were returning to the community, they were saying, I'm having to start all over again. And unfortunately, for people who are engaged with the system, it's like a revolving door. And so like once you're caught in it, it's really hard to become disengaged from it. So people were, there was one question in our survey where we asked them, how many times have you been incarcerated since you were 18? And that's the one question where people had to like stop and count because they were, I think on average, incarcerated between 13 to 15 times or something like that since they were an adult. So people were spending a significant amount of their adult lives behind bars. But when they came out, they also were making up for lost time is what I'm saying. So they were engaging in drug use, more drug use, which is problematic post-incarceration because your tolerance levels are low. And then when you start to use a lot, it really increases your risk for overdose. And it affects your decision-making if you are going to have sex. So a lot of people returned quickly to using drugs, and a lot of people were having unprotected sex with multiple partners. So there were just a lot of challenges that they experienced in reestablishing their lives. Like for those who had HIV or other chronic health conditions, they had, disruptions in care. So they had to go back, get insurance again, because it wasn't just suspended. They lost all of their coverage. And so they had to do that all over again, wait for it so that they could get access to medication. And they did not get much. From what people were telling me, when they were released from incarceration, they got about $40 and that's it. For those who had HIV, who were fortunate enough to have medication left, either they got a 1 month supply, they were really fortunate, or they just were able to take what they had left. And for some people, it was less than a week's supply. So, I mean, that's really problematic. A lot of them are often under community supervision. And so that means that you're being followed by a parole or a probation officer. And so like you have very strict rules about like what you have to do while you're in the community. Some of the people are under like really close monitoring. So they have ankle bracelets, so you can't leave your home at certain periods of time and things like that. It was just a lot. And there was a lot of demands on their time. And so like that was a huge stressor for them, regardless of if they had HIV or not. And so some of the key findings from our in-depth interviews. So we interviewed 26 Black men who were recently released from incarceration. As far as drug use, they mentioned that they were entering into these drug enticing environments where that's where they were getting their supply. It was from their roommates. A lot of them were in SROs, which are single residency occupancy living. This is like communal living arrangements throughout the city. And they mentioned, and so this is in New York City, and so they mentioned that there are a lot of challenges for those who were committed to recovery and trying to stay clean. Like they were accessing drugs in settings that were considered zero tolerance. They were supposed to be zero tolerance environments, and clearly that wasn't the case. So a lot of them were accessing drugs in housing and through their social networks as well. And what I found interesting, and I use this information actually to inform the R01 application that I'll talk about a little later and that Teo mentioned. The housing was largely dictated by the New York State Department of Corrections. So the way that it works in New York City and in a lot of places, and from what I understand is starting to change, is that you can't just go back to where you were previously. You can go back to your previous community under certain conditions. A lot of people aren't able to access public housing or vouchers anymore if they committed a felony. They can't even live there if it's someone else's residence. And so participants told me about being reported when they tried to like sleep on their girlfriend's couch or sleep on their father's couch or something like that. People would report them. And so they did not even have access to public housing. And as a lot of you know, like housing in New York City is especially expensive. And so like these are people who were unstably unhoused, most of them, I would say. And when we asked them about condomless sexual behaviors, really interesting. This, I don't think is unique to this population, but there was a strong resistance to condoms. Nobody likes condoms, especially with their main partners, because as they're coming out, they wanted to show that like there's trust in a relationship. Condomless sexual behavior was pretty common, and condom use was inconsistent regardless of their HIV status. And that's one of the reasons why my thoughts shifted around what kind of intervention I wanted to create. This is the moment when I decided that I wanted to focus on people who already had HIV, because a lot of them, compared to the people who were not living with HIV, had a higher number of sexual partners. And were using condoms inconsistently. For those who did use them, they were used incorrectly, and there was a delay when they put them on. And then they just talked about hating them. Like one of the barriers was that they were not fitting well, that there wasn't a variety of different sizes. And that's interesting because when we were recruiting for the project, we distributed recruitment flyers throughout New York City. And for most of the agencies we went to, these are community agencies that really serve people who experience incarceration. They had these large bowls of condoms, like everywhere. They're free, they're, widely accessible, but they complained about them. The quality was poor, they tore easily. And so when I decided to do an intervention, I asked the Department of Corrections to send us condoms, and they did. They sent us a lot. And we asked them about quality. We asked them to send a range of different sizes and things like that so that people had options, because condoms are expensive and you don't want that to be the barrier to people using them on a more consistent basis. So we learned a lot during that process. So what I decided to do was use that information to do a pilot study to test the feasibility and preliminary efficacy of a combination art adherence and risk reduction intervention. We called the main one project Adherence, Education, and Risk Evaluation. You have to have an acronym for your study. And when I started this, we only had a few examples. A lot of people hadn't done work in this specific area, and now I know why. You have it in your mind, like this needs to be done, and I'm going to be the one to do it. Now I know why. It is incredibly difficult to try to address all of these issues. We tried to improve art adherence, reduce substance use, and reduce condomless sexual behavior. So it was a lot. It was a huge undertaking. And so just to give you a sense of the design and the methods that we used, we did a huge literature search to find out what was already available, what interventions that already existed would seem appropriate for this population. And we modeled our interventions on a few EBIs that obviously were part of like the CDC. And so we also created and convened a community advisory board. It wasn't by design, but most of them were formerly incarcerated individuals from social service agencies. That was unexpected. When we went for recruitment, a lot of the people who were working there already had some lived experiences. And so we tried to leverage that here. Like we didn't make that a requirement for being part of the CAB. I think that is one of those unexpected benefits. And we also engaged 2 of our former participants. Another thing that I didn't anticipate, so this research was going on when I was an assistant professor at Columbia. So Columbia is a private campus. And so whenever you go into one of the buildings, you have to show your ID, you have to show that you belong there. That was problematic for my population. So like we spent a lot of time working with security guards and things like that so that people will feel welcomed when they came into our environment, because people were, I'm not going to say they were being harassed, but they didn't necessarily feel comfortable coming in. And this is after I had told security, whenever we had an interview, we had a schedule and we would say, we have this many people coming at this time. Like I would tell them all of the information they needed to know. There was still an issue. And so I started placing students at the entrance to the building so that they could personally escort our participants to my office, because they're involved with the legal system. They're using drugs, they're using, So the one thing I don't want to do is have them feel uncomfortable coming in to talk to me, because that for this intervention too, we had a follow-up period. So like, if they're not treated well the first time, they're not going to come back for the follow-up session. And then too, like, it's just a human rights issue. Like, you know what, I treat people well, period. And so for our methods, we used the same methods that we did for the formative research, where we just distributed flyers to all kind of agencies throughout all boroughs in New York City. We even went to Staten Island. No one seems to go there. So at one point, I will say we had our flyers posted at over 50 different sites throughout the city. And so our inclusion criteria were people who were HIV positive on medication, had a history of drug use, only adults, and people who were released from a correctional institution within the past 5 years. Also, we were only interested in people who had a detectable viral load because we wanted to help support people who were having challenges in that area. And this was only for English speaking because we just didn't have the resources to translate any of our materials. So we interviewed people at 3 different time points, at baseline, at 1 month, and 3-month follow-up. And here's the compensation, which people told me really low, and I get that. So this was years ago that we did this. I want to say this was 5 or 6 years ago now. But the thing about K, for those of you who are familiar with the mechanism, you do not get a lot of research funds through a K. And that's okay. So I had to work well with what I had, especially because like I wanted to pay them more as the study went on. So at 30, they got $30 for baseline, and this is cash, and that's another battle. We had to fight with the university on whether or not we should be able to give cash to people who have a history of drug use. That's a whole other thing. So we gave them $30 at baseline, $50 for each intervention session that they completed, and then they got $75 when they came for their 3-month follow-ups. And I want to say 65 at 1 month follow-up. Here are the components. When we looked at medication adherence, because so many of the people had learned of their status while they were incarcerated, we wanted to give them sort of an education about like what it means to have HIV. A lot of people weren't even familiar with, even though they were living with HIV, they weren't familiar with all of the different transmission modes. So we wanted to talk to them about what HIV does to your body. Why is it important to be adherent to your medication? Like, why is that useful? What are potential barriers? And then we help them like develop an action plan. What are some of the side effects? Because that can be a barrier for people being adherent as well. And then we help them create an action plan. We didn't just want to say, you know what, go away from this, do this on your own. We wanted them to be with us to create this plan collaboratively. For the condomless sexual behavior, we talked about the importance of being consistent, like told them that they could be at risk for acquiring different additional STIs. I want to say about, I can't remember off the top of my head, but between 30 to 40% also had a history of other STIs in addition to HIV. We talked about potential barriers to condom use, and we did a condom use demonstration. A lot of people did not know how to use condoms appropriately. And for substance use, we talked about triggers, but just about the decision-making. And how substance use impacts ART adherence. And then this was a controversy at the time. We talked about harm reduction, because for people who are incarcerated and who were incarcerated and who are under community supervision, it's an abstinence only system. Like, they want to make sure that you are not using drugs at all. So for harm reduction, it really talks about how to use drugs safer. Like, you don't expect people to necessarily achieve abstinence. For me, that's really unrealistic because just a lot of people aren't there yet. And so we wanted to also give them tools to make better decisions while they're using drugs. And so that was a controversy, because if you're under community supervision, you are subject to random urine analysis tests. And if something comes back positive, you can be reincarcerated again. And so like, I still thought that it was important to mention how to do it safely, even if the expectation was abstinence. And here's how it was set up, I guess, for ADHERE. It was the 3-session intervention, where again, we mentioned all of those things in 3 different sessions. They were around 2 hours. And I can say that it didn't feel that way. Like, it seems like people really enjoyed the sessions. They didn't complain about time at the end. So that's good that people felt like it was worth their time. And then the reason that I decided to do kind of an abbreviated version is because the more I learn about people living with HIV who experience incarceration and who use drugs, the more I think that it's important to give them access to something. And so I wanted them to have the benefit of learning about HIV and what it does to their body as well, because they're in a similar situation. They also probably learned about their status while they were incarcerated. And so this was just a small sample. It was just 30 people who were randomized to either adhere or MACE, just to give you some idea of what their characteristics are. They weren't drastically different, except for the transgender category. They were randomized. I don't know how all of the transgender participants ended up in the lengthier intervention session. But if you look across the other categories, it's a pretty good spread. And the good thing about this population is they had managed to live with HIV for a long period of time. We're talking about people who have been living with HIV for around 2 decades on average. And for incarceration in years, around 1 or 2 years on average. And when we looked at changes from baseline to 3-month follow-up, you can see that for adherence, it was actually the abbreviated version that experienced, which we did not expect, which experienced I would say higher ART adherence levels. So here's a table comparing them, baseline and follow-up, according to intervention group. And I'm not even going to pay that much attention to the p-value because it's such a small number of people that we're talking about. But a higher percentage of the MACE participants reported that they did not miss any dose in the past month. So again, we were happy to have any progress in this area. And again, this is over a 3-month follow-up period. And another finding that we were really excited about was drug use in the past 3 months. That was reduced in both interventions. And so that's kind of what we wanted to see. When we looked at unprotected sex, so for the MACE group, they're the abbreviated version. So they didn't get any content on drug use or sexual behavior at all. And so you can see that there was a substantial reduction in unprotected sex in the past 3 months for the adhere group, 6 people down to 1. And for the MACE group, it was only a difference of 1. And then if you look at their viral loads for adhere, on average, it went up significantly, but it went down a little for MACE. And for the viral loads, we looked at it, we didn't pay that much attention to it because it was so complicated. And what happened is there were a couple of people who had extremely high viral loads in the adhere category, in that adhere group that really pushed it up a little bit. But for us, we wanted to see, could we detect any differences over a 3-month period? And obviously we could. And so it's still positive finding for the abbreviated version group, the 1 session, which kind of shows that you can do something with just 1 session. And I think what happens with the lengthier group, the 3-session intervention, I think that may just be too much for some people. Like it may be that thing, it's like, you can't do everything with this population. Maybe less is more for this population, like just focusing on like the importance of being adherent to your medication, what HIV does to your body. That may be enough to make significant changes or potential changes. I don't know, this was a pilot test, so I don't want to overstate the findings, but I think it's something that we are proud of. So just a summary of our key findings from the pilot test: both intervention groups improved their medication adherence and reduced their drug use, which is great. The MACE group, though, experienced greater reductions. Sorry, I shouldn't say reductions, improvements in medication adherence at 3-month follow-up, and they reduced their viral load overall. However, and I didn't report that here, but we also did a 1-month follow-up session, and we found that the risk reductions were greater at 1-month follow-up compared to 3-month follow-up, which you would expect. And so that's why a lot of people would do these booster sessions, but just something that I would take into consideration in the future when I'm developing interventions with this population. So some key considerations or takeaway points. One of the reasons why I wanted to do this was to determine whether or not it was feasible. Like I mentioned before, a lot of people hadn't done work in this area, so we wanted to see, would people come? Would they show up? Would they appreciate it? You know what I mean? Would they think that this is a valuable use of their time? So yeah, it's feasible, but we also have to be mindful that, and this isn't the only pilot test that has shown that, right, that it may not have lasting impact on drug use. Like when we saw the differences between 1 month and 3 months, I mean, they were substantial differences. It's still encouraging, right? But we just know that like in the future, when I'm developing interventions, I have to really design something that is kind of built to last and that is more sustainable than what we have here. But also more holistic approaches needed. One thing I think we did well, we had a lot of behavioral scientists on our team. And so that's why I think that we saw some gains in some of the condomless sexual behaviors and the drug use. But I don't think I would do an intervention like this again with people living with HIV without having some kind of connection to a clinic, to electronic health records or things like that. So I can really monitor their behaviors and their adherence over time. And I really think a holistic approach is needed. Like I can't just focus, like this is a population who really needs access to services, like beyond, their HIV status. And so I really need to think seriously about like what that means for this population and like how that's important for our future intervention designs. Also, I remember when we were thinking about recruitment sites and people were saying, don't recruit from clinics because those are people who are doing extremely well. No, from their viral loads, you can tell we did recruit from clinics and they weren't doing so well. People were engaged in care largely. I would say about 90% of our sample had been to a doctor's appointment over the last 3 months, but you could see from their viral loads, they still weren't doing very well when you look at their medication adherence. This is also a population who has a unique experience with law enforcement. So one of the barriers to adherence was some participants indicated that they didn't feel comfortable carrying their medication around because if they were stopped by the police, they may think that they were drugs and they may be incarcerated again. And so like that's a unique challenge that I'm still kind of grappling with this population. So they were telling me if I don't take my medication before I leave home, and some of them had a 3-pill regimen, if I don't take it before I leave home, and then I don't get to take it again until the next day because of all of the demands of their time. They're getting home late. They're, you know what I mean? It's just not a priority. And so that was an unfortunate finding as well from some of the more formative research. And I'll just mention this quickly because I see I'm out of time. But one of the things that I decided to do after that intervention was not necessarily scale it up. That seems like that would be the logical next step, right? But I went back to looking at substance use and the fact that, and I don't think I showed it here, but I would say over 80% of this sample had reported a history of drug use, of drug treatment, for their drug use. And so I really wanted to go back to that and look at some of their substance use and look at how that had changed over time, whether or not they were living with HIV or not. So I had this idea, and this came from looking at their living environment and what they were going through when they were transitioning back to the community from custody. The fact that they said that where they were going, where they were living, which was mandated by the Department of Corrections, is the same place where they were also accessing drugs, even if they were committed to recovery. So I wanted to look more seriously at that. So I got an R01 funded where we're looking at characterizing their substance use post-incarceration. So we're following people as they come out of prisons and jails in the area for a 12-month period. We're going to interview them and take urine samples at 5 different time points. So at baseline and then every 3 months up to a year. We're going to look at some of those individual level and environmental level predictors of their post-incarceration substance use. And one of the things that I would like to do, I really think that we should leverage our tools that already exist, like in our fight. And for me, it's about addiction support, but it's also about for people who are living with HIV, making sure that they have access to services and support that they need to live healthier lives. So for me, I want to use a tool that already exists. It's called the ASAM PPC. And what it does is it produces a composite score that lets you know what is a recommended level of treatment for someone who is managing addiction. And I want to know, because this population tends to be mandated to addiction treatment, I want to know if what they're receiving is appropriate for what is the recommended level through the ASAM, which is American Society of Addiction Medicine, I believe. And so the good thing about the ASAM PPC is it includes questions about all of these dimensions and all of these dimensions that we know are important for people who are managing addiction. So they're going to look at withdrawal potential, co-occurring conditions and biomedical conditions, readiness to change their living environment. And so I'm really excited about that. We're still in our first year, but that is what's on my agenda next. And finally, I want to acknowledge everyone who has allowed me to do this research, including the men and women who actually shared their stories with us, and all of you for being here. So thank you.